Welcome back, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brodt. It has now been over a week since the Petir of Reb Chaim, and many of us have heard many Hespedim. We've read Hespedim, we watched Hespedim, and there's been a tremendous Hisorus. People are learning and feeling that there's a tremendous Aveda, and they want to fill that void. The Hisorus that Klal Yisrael has had over the last week and a half has been something that I certainly have never ever witnessed, and I've heard this from people who are a lot older than me that they've never witnessed and felt this type of the feeling of a gadol that has passed on, and the clamoring for people to have a connection, to learn about Reb Chaim and take on a little bit in his memory. So last time we spoke about the Sefer Kiryas Melech, we got some tremendous feedback from the listeners. I'll just read a couple of the emails that we got, the messages. One person wrote that the Jewish world needs a video and a series like this for each and every Sefer of Reb Chaim Zatzal. Most people have no idea about his greatness in Torah, and presentations like this one shed some light upon him and his astounding knowledge of Torah. Someone else wrote, I listened to your segment on Reb Chaim Kanievsky Zatzal Seforim. I think this is the best tribute, a meaningful review of his Seforim and their importance. Yasha Kechacha. So it's certainly an angle that many people don't know, and Rabbi Brodt, Baruch Hashem, you're able to contribute in this way to enlighten people about the godless of Reb Chaim through his Seforim. For this time, we want to speak about three Seforim. One is called Yishav Hadas. One is called his Pirush on the Archas Chaim, which is Miyuchas to the Rush. The third one is a countries he wrote called Tashlum Yefei Einayim. Eliezer, how are you?
Baruch Hashem. Very good.
Okay, so you want to start with the Yishav Hadas, or give some context of how you want to go about and why you picked maybe these three Seforim.
Yeah, so I'm going to begin as follows. Before I get to the three Seforim that I would like to focus on today, just a drop of background to why I picked these Seforim first. As in the past, ever since the Petira of Reb Chaim, there's been a crazy amount of the Spedim, both written, orals, video recordings all over the world, in America, Eretz Yisrael, everywhere, from all types of people that knew him, people that just saw him from afar, and people saying over stories and different things about him and anecdotes. A thing that came up a few times, I noticed, in various hespedim or comments about him was Reb Chaim a Balkishrin from the early age? Was he an Eloi? Now, of course, as I saw in an interview that someone published with Michael Zilber, he says we have no business to even talk about it. It's not even a real question. And as I'm going to show, the question is really it's not a question to be asked because it's silly. Basically, of course, his asmada and his tremendous learning, and as we mentioned last time, that he was learning called Torah Kula, being Messiah every year, contributed to who he became. But already from the some of the Seforim that I'm picking to discuss today, which are written when he was very young, the answer will be obvious that he was already unique from a very young age. As a matter of fact, one of his grandchildren writes in the Sefer I quoted last time called Seforim that even before his bar mitzvah, he had Torah that he felt that ended up being incorporated in his Sefer Sichasada volume in the volume 3. There's no dates which are those pieces of Torah, but basically he had notebooks already from material of stuff of his from before he was bar mitzvah. Throughout in a later presentation, we'll talk about some other works that he wrote when he was, let's say, 14. But these works that we're going to be focusing on today are written. It seems he's written some of them are written. He started working on them as a bacher in Petach Tikva, and then later on, when he decided to print them, he went over them again, and then he published them. Okay, so last time I mentioned that one of the Seforim that I got attracted, the original Seforim that I think when I was young I took a liking to was Sichasada, which the time I bought it had 2 volumes, and it includes basically 8 different Seforim. It could be that they were printed individually, I don't know, Or at least some of them were printed individually, but I do know that they were printed numerous times. Some of them were printed over 10 times, and each time he added in different new corrections and additions. Now,
So I'm sure people are gonna call in and write in that it's pronounced Siachasada, Sichasada. So whoever has those issues can send those in. And also, I would think also it's worth mentioning that the Shin Yurches were his initials, right?
Yes, definitely. Now, I would also like to say at this point a disclaimer. I apologize in advance if I pronounce names of Svarim words wrong. Do not be medayik in anything I say of this type. I make mistakes. I try to make it. I do try to say it right, but sometimes it's hopeless. Anyway, with that introduction, so in this sefer, so there's a kuntris in the second volume. It's called Yishuv Hadas. And what is the Yishuv Hadas? So, in one sentence, it is he goes through Shas to answer up every time the Marsha ends a piece saying V'yesh li Yashiv. And so Chaim went through Shas to answer up all those times that the Marsha says it. Now, what I like to do is to discuss, to give the background behind this, the significance of this, and of the Sefer. And the story is as follows. Last time I mentioned already that I would like to claim, and it could be it's obvious, it could be many others claim it, or will claim it, that Reb Chaim Kanievsky was impacted by a few different Gedolim. He was impacted by a lot of Gedolim, but he was impacted by 4 particular Gedolim. My claim was that he was impacted by his uncle, the Chazon Ish, who he grew up by, lived in the same house, he learned with him, his father, the Stipler, the Mishnah Brura, and the Vilna Gaon. I would like today to give some samples of some of the influences of some of these people. So in this first Sefer, in the Sefer Yishuv Hadas, already one of the things that's very interesting with Reb Chaim Kanievsky is you don't have to come up with Tyrus why he wrote certain Sefarim. Most of his Sefarim has an introduction where he says, he pretty much says, sometimes he writes a very bekitzer, but he says some of the motives, so to speak, behind why he's writing the Sefer, which in general is very useful information. When you look at a Sefer, you look at the introduction. Some Sefarim don't have, early back, sometimes Sefarim don't have introductions, but Reb Chaim wrote a lot of times why he chose this specific topic to write about it. So in the Sefer Yishuv Hadas, he brings down a famous letter of the Chazon Ish about the importance of learning the Marsha. So before we get to the Chazon Ish's letter, I would like to give some background of what's behind this Sefer and what it meant. So first we'll start with is the Marsha, because he's coming to answer the Marsha. So we'll back up a little bit with the Marsha, with the acceptance of the Marsha, and then through that we'll be able to understand what the Chazon Ish wrote and what Reb Chaim Kanievsky was doing in the Sefer. So the Marsha was in the world, he's very famous for writing a pirush, both on halacha, under I guess call it the regular parts of the Gemara, and also the Aggadah Gemaras. He's born somewhere in the year 1550, between 1555 to 1565. They're not sure the exact year, and he dies in 1631. He's a Rav in various places, Rosh Yeshiva in a few different cities. He's one of the Gedolim that was part of the Vadar Baratzos. He gives askamas to some Svarim in his lifetime, and Lamashal, he was very involved with the famous Siddur of Reb Shapsi Sefer. His Sefer, some of his Torah starts coming out already in his lifetime, such as his Chedusha Halachas comes out, I believe it was 1611. Material of his came out earlier, but that's not important for today's context. A lot has been written about him. Most famous is a small sefer, a very nice sefer, available on Hebrew books, called Toldos Adam from Reuven Margolis, a very, very nice sefer. Now, in general, when one wants to know about his particular gadol, a good stop to start with is the Chida. The Chida in Shem HaGedolim, when he talks about the Marsha, he says he was a tremendous gadol, etc., and he wrote a Chidusha Halachos, and then he says it's on Roiv HaTalmud, and it sheds light on the Gemara and Taisvis. And then he says, "Ubefrat beglilois Ashkenaz v'hamayir v'lois zazu mechavoi v'kol oiskim boy." That everyone was into it, And he talks about he mentions a sentence about the Chedusha Agadis, which is not for not to focus on today. Now, the Sefer becomes accepted, as the Chida writes, and we find different as time goes on, it gets more and more accepted. Now, the Chida, who lives much later, one of the things famous about the Chida was he traveled. He traveled all over Europe, fundraising for Eretz Yisrael. In the past few months, his travels that he published, that he didn't publish, that he wrote, which were published a while ago, 2 new editions came out of these travels. They're fascinating material. And a lot of times he transcribes different materials of people that he met or saw or things he heard. So at one point he talks about he met some Gedolim, and he refers to them that they were being very Isaac in Taisvis and the Marshal and the Marsha with great iyun. Okay, he describes such a conversation that he had, that he watched, or I think that he might have had with them. Okay, then elsewhere in the Magal Tov, he describes something that he heard from someone, an old Zaken, about the Rebbe. He's known as the Rebbe of Heschel, although he had nothing to do with Hasidus, as he predates Hasidus, but the Rebbe of Heschel, as he's fondly called. And basically, he brings down a very sharp story that they say about the Rebbe of Heschel. Someone he saw a Marsha, he got very angry, and he threw the Sefer down. He was very upset about the Marsha, and then it turns out later on he realized he might have been mistaken. And he talks a little bit about it. He has a few lines about this story, but he brings down. But here we see that at least someone as great, the Rebbe of Heschel was a great Rosh Yeshiva at that time, had some type of was some type of a snagdus, so to speak, against the Marsha. Okay. A little before the Chida, there was a great Gaon. His name was Rabbi Lansdorfer, who died very young, but he wrote a lot. He was prolific, and he's in the world of halacha, in the areas that he wrote about, he's very much quoted. He wrote a tzava, and in the tzava, he talks about the Marsha, and he says something else. He says that when he talks about giving eitzos about what to learn and how to learn properly, so he says you should be medayik rav on the pirish of the Marsha. And he says it could help you understand the sugyas, the Aimek Halacha. It's written with great kitzer. Then he says it had to have been written with Ruach HaKodesh, because a human being could not have written this sefer. Okay. So we see that different people had different, and there's other quotes, and if one checks, and I'm not here to speak barichus about all the pratim about the Marsha, although it's a worthwhile topic. But I'm trying just to give some, just to be able to appreciate what Chaim Kanievsky was doing. A bit later, we find, let's say in Volozhin, it's recorded a story, maybe even more than one story, and it sounds like from the story, the vibe one gets is that the Netziv wasn't so happy with his nephew, he saw him being Isaac in a Marsha. He said, that's for a different time. Now, what's strange is that if one looks in the Netziv's writings, let's say, you'll see he quotes the Marsha many, many times in all his writings. Not only that, one sefer that came out, which deals with the Marsha, the Netziv gave a beautiful askama. So what's the pshat behind this? Let's say, if you even could read so much into it that there was some type of a snagness, but there are other places that it sounds like some people were sort of upset about the Netziv, not about the Netziv, about the Marsha. So many times when one's looking, there was a great, a very special person in the previous generation. His name was Rav Shlomo Yosef Zevin. He wrote multiple svarim, and one of his svarim, which is called Ishim Vashitas, a lot of times he could say something, a sentence, and derech agav, from that you could understand, you could learn a lot from it. So he's talking about the Marsha, and it sounds like that it became sort of that people were focusing on it too much. Of course, the Marsha is a sefer nifla, and its lashon is very meduyak, but sometimes kitzonit, extremism gets too extreme. And what happened is that people were spending too much time on the Marsha, and they were losing focus from to being focusing on what the Marsha really wanted you to do, which was to learn Rashi and Tosfos and the Gemara. And it became a thing that people were mamish spending too much time at it. So it's very possible that was more what the Netziv was getting nervous. Not that, of course, that it's very important to learn Marsha, but everything has to have be done in the proper amount of time and focus. Now, and this could be found in various, and there's makom to say such a thing. Okay, but we're not going to go into barichos. Now, there's a great sefer from a Rabbi. His name was Rav Greenspan. And this Rav Greenspan wrote a sefer called Meleches Machshavas. In Meleches Machshavas, he talks about. He also has a arichos, and in his arichos he talks about the Marsha, and when he describes it, he says the following lashon, beautiful lashon: Chidushav ha'amukim megalim le'einenu as kol ginzei hasugya mekomit. And a lot of times it could help us understand the signon haklasi shel Rabbi Seinu Rashi v'chachmei hatzarfas v'nifla davar, and it's shabachol charifoisai. Hagyonis ha'amukas ad moed ach megalalanu es hapshat hapashot shel chachmei Talmud, and he goes on and on. He has it's a schulum yichedes loy shu daiken yotzim migeder ragil, and it's very focused on Rashi and Tosfos, and v'chulu. He talks about this a lot in a sefer Meleches Machshavas, which was recently reprinted in a beautiful edition by Mechon Yerushalayim. Al kol panim, and there's a lot more to say about it, but B'kitzer, many Gedolim, we find, on the other hand, they were very into the Marsha. Mashal, I just saw recently a quote from Rabbi Shulei Diskin, how he was very into learning the Marsha. And others were also very much into the Marsha. Okay, now, with this background, that now we could begin to understand the Chazon Ish. There's the Chazon Ish, it's one of the first, maybe it's even the first, Igra, there's Igra's Chazon Ish, and the first letter is about learning the Marsha. And the Chazon Ish says that he has a taina on his generation, that the generation stopped learning Marsha. And he says the Marsha is matana toiva nitna li Yisrael l'zakis b'is hadoyers haba machrav. Why? And one should be maimik to learn it properly, and it teaches one iyun nachain v'amayk. He also says it helps l'zikarin kol sugi lepratel. And he says the previous generations did appreciate the Marsha. And then he throws out, he says, V'hagoyin Rabbi Akiva Eiger lo yinich davar misifrei. And then he says, Kimaduma sheken kasav b'kairis toldoisav. And then we'll get back to that part in a second. And he says, from when the people left learning this sefer, they lost out in Yediyas Hapshat Kulai. And it helps learning Iyam properly, and Ein Mishi Yachzar Tar Liyoshna, and B'kitzur is very, very and this letter has been quoted by many people in today's generation. That I've heard it many times in Shmuzin that it's a shame people have stopped learning the Marsha, and this is Chazon Ish.
Was the Chazon Ish addressing something specific, something that was going on? Anything you could track? Are you going to get to that, or do you know?
I wish I knew I don't recall if I have seen what the backstory of this letter of the Chazon Ish is, and it's a good question. A lot of times we don't know the backstory. Who was this letter addressed to, and what was it about? I'm not sure. I have to look if there is an answer for this one, because some letters we do have, and the story is actually a lot of times could get more interesting. But anyway, this is a known thing about the Chazon Ish. Now, as I said, the Chazon Ish throws out about Rabbi Akiva Eiger. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger, it's in the Talmud of Rabbi Akiva Eiger that I know that the Chazon Ish looked at, which was the famous Chura Mashulish. I could not find mention about the Marsha, but in the Hagdama to the Drush V'Chiddush of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, the sons already write that our father, Rabbi Akiva Eiger, he didn't really have time to look at Achronim on the Sugya, but what was Chaviv for him? Ki im divrei Marsha. And that was the main Achron that he looked at. And he made sure to spend time using it. In one of the recent works on Rabbi Akiva Eiger called Ma'irin Shel Yisrael, so they have I would say 3-4 pages of different places where Rabbi Akiva Eiger talks about a Marsha with unbelievable titles. We see that the Marsha was very, very important for Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Now, but more than that, not only was he important for Rabbi Akiva Eiger in for learning, as it's clear, I was doing a search in a sefer. One of the early Seforim of Rabbi Akiva that came out was Hagais on Shulchan Aruch Ar Chaim Ha'aris, and even in that sefer, which is Ha'aris on Ar Chaim, he quotes it many times. And those Ha'aris are a lot of times more relate to halacha. This is obviously relates to a different discussion, which we're not going to go into now, about the Marsha being lahalacha, and we do find many Gedalei Paiskim do use it because it is crucial to understand a lot of times the sugya, and the way the Marsha will help understand the sugya, it will have effects, but we will leave that for now. Now, so what the Chazon Ish is being madgish, and so too, and he sees it also in one of the Gedalei of the Dairis before Rabbi Akiva Eiger, was that there's a major significance in the Marsha, so much so that it bothered the Chazon Ish that it became forgotten, so to speak. Now, the besides for I when I was learning in yeshiva in the Mir, so I heard shir. One of the people I heard shir from was Rameir Shmulevitz, and we were learning at the time Kedushin, and he said an interesting remark. Kedushin, the first parak, a lot of it has to do with drashas and cheshbainis and drashas of how we learn out different dinim from psukim. And he said that a lot of times the Olam HaYeshivas, so he said there was a sefer at the time, and which was an earlier sefer, a famous Achron, the Atzmas Yosef. So Rameir Shmulevitz said that the Olam HaYeshivas, they took on to learn the Atzmas Yosef, they use it a lot for the Lamdisha pieces. But most of the sefer is handling in the cheshbainis of the Gemara. It's an excellent sefer to be Isaac and to understand the cheshbainis of the Gemara. Daima, on some level, there's parallels similar to what the Marsha is doing. Maybe there's also differences. Al Kapanim, he said, and Rameir Shmulevitz's line, he's the younger son of Rabbi Chaim Shmulevitz, that people think it's a galus. We don't need to look at those pieces. He says, no, because we can't even understand it. We're not understanding that there's so much happening in the Gemara and because we're focused more on different points, just on the Lamdas and the Cheshbon of the Gemara and the Shakavatari of the Gemara. Rashi Taisis is not as much stressed. So the Chazon Ish, and anyone who looks at his Seforim knows that was a very fundamental point of his. The text of the Gemara, the learning of the Gemara, the Shakavatari and the Cheshbonis is beyond important. Now, with this introduction, we get closer to our story with Reb Chaim Kanievsky. The Marsha wrote very bekitzer.
If I recall, when I was in yeshiva, my Rosh Yeshiva must have said something, either asked a question or something about the Marsha, and somebody went over to him afterwards and wanted to maybe answer a question that he had or something with the Marsha. And if I recall correctly, he said something along the lines of, did you think about the Marsha for more than an hour? He says, you have to fast to understand this Marsha. The significance that they held for understanding a Marsha was great.
Correct, yes, but it seems even today, I don't know for sure, but it sounds like it's still lost on some level. It sounds like the Chazon Ish's complaint is still relevant. Now, but the Marsha, he wrote very bekitzer, and sometimes he was just coming to be ma'ayrer points, and he felt that if one goes on the right track of learning, you'll get to the right point. So he wrote v'yesh liyashiv, that if you understand the Shakavatari and you look at it carefully enough, you'll be able to come up with the answer. It means that he wasn't trying to ask these earth-shattering questions or stump people. It was actually it's legendary about the Marsha is that the Chibur was written with his Talmidim. He learned to Talmidim, and not only that, certain parts he skipped because he didn't learn with Talmidim because he was busy at the famous Yerid that he used to go to as being part of the Vadar Baratzos. But the Chibur was a Chibur written with Talmidim, and it was to get Talmidim to learn. So he felt, I don't need to answer, I don't need to spell out everything. And so he wrote very bekitzer. And he even says this in his Hagdama, that he wrote very bekitzer. Now, fast forward after the Marsha, we mentioned earlier, the Marsha is already printed as early as the 1611, so we get to the 1700s. And there was two people, they were, I think they might even been Rosh Yeshiva. One's name was Reb Shloime ben Reb Shmuel. He was in Gritz, and he had a so he had a friend, Reb Yitzchak Halperin. And they, in the 1760s, they decided, and it's very unique because it's not so common to find two people put out a sefer together. We have samples of such a thing, but they're not so common. And they put out a sefer called Hirasha. And Hirasha, one of the main focuses was to go through marshas that he left off of V'yesh Liyashiv. And they say in the Hagdama, we don't know too much about them, but in the Hagdama, they already emphasize that today, people, they still understand the significance of Taka learning the Marsha, but they get stuck on it. So what the Marsha nem done was a davar pashut, it needs to be spelled out. So they went in a pshat-oriented way so that people who don't have as much time to spend learning a Pe'iyun would be able to know what possibly he meant with his V'yesh Liyashiv. So, and they put it out. It seems the Sefer was very popular. It was printed numerous times, maybe 7-8 times in the 1800s. So that usually means it's very, very popular. Okay, now, so now we get to Reb Chaim Kanievsky. Reb Chaim Kanievsky writes in his Hagdama that when he was young, and his lashon is Vine b'yaldusi kasafti gam ken bezeh b'shnash tafshin ches. Okay, he's about 20 years old at the time. And he's learning in Yeshivas Petach Tikva, the Reb Chaim Kanievsky says, I made it my business to learn the Marsha. He says, V'hine Rabbeinu Marsha kam upam kitzer b'dvarov. And he says, V'yesh liyashiv at the end, V'yesh l'chalek. And he doesn't explain why, because kisamach ala ma'ayin she'yavim me'atzmoi. And many people are miyageya to understand it. So he says, there was a Sefer Yakar called Hirasha. But it sounds like he didn't know about it at first. So he went and he sat and he went through all of Shas and all of Marsha, and he answers them all. We're not talking about, okay, he did it for a few things. He does it. It's almost 60 pages. He goes through Gan Shas to Bin Yashiv, the Marsha. When he went to print it later on, he checked and he saw he was mechavan a lot of times to the Sefer Hirasha, so he took out those pieces, unless he felt maybe he had a better answer. And then he begins and he says, what's behind it? The first paragraph introduction is he brings the whole lashon of this amazing letter of the Chazon Ish. So here we see him taking on at a young age. I don't know so many people today, young bachrim, that could go through all of Shas and answer the Yesh Liyashiv of the Marsha Keseder. We're talking about all different Masechtas over here. The Marsha wrote on everything, or most of Shas, come out all of Shas, and to do this. So it's a very unique feat. Now, the part of the influence is because he was doing what he learned and saw from his uncle, the Chazon Ish, and it had a tremendous impact on him, and he felt this is an important thing. Now, of course, it didn't necessarily take off in the yeshiva world. Most people never even heard of this sefer. I would say in the 1979, someone went ahead and printed a sefer called Kavitz Mefarshei Marsha, and in the sefer he printed 4 svarim that were written previously on the Marsha, and at the end he got permission from Chaim Kanievsky to include his sefer, and he printed it. And it's interesting is Chaim Kanievsky writes in this edition that it wasn't written with proper iyun; it was just to be ma'ir leiv hama'ayin. Okay, say akopanim. This is the first sefer that I would like to mention, and here we see one of the points I'm also trying to bring out is that his somewhat of an aspect of his connection with the Chazon Ish. To conclude this prat, just to mention a drop about this with the Chazon Ish. Throughout looking through all his works, we could see his impact, and I hope to discuss that more in a different time. But just in the sefer Time Dekra. The Sefer Time Dekra on the back. So there is a small kuntris which he included things that he heard from his mother about Hanhagas of the Chazon Ish. It's approximately 40 different Hanhagas that his mother told him, and he recorded them in his Time Dekra already way back. Now, interestingly, I recently learned that the Chaim Kanievsky has a sefer about the Chazon Ish Hanhagas that he himself saw living in the house of the Chazon Ish, that he recorded, and his father had him write this down. For some reason, it wasn't printed. It seems that he said that he's allowing his children to print it. So hopefully we'll be zeichet to have it soon. And one last thing is, in recent years, a lot of material has come out on the Chazon Ish. One of the famous works that came out was the Maisa Ish, multiple volumes. Used to be, it came out one volume and people said, okay, and then another volume and another volume and another volume. Then they even put out an index and they put out another volume and another volume. Anyway, at one point, it seems they brought to Chaim Kanievsky, he gave also a bunch of pages of Hanhagis that he saw by the Chazon Ish. Okay, this is the first sefer that I wanted to discuss, and this aspect of his connection with the Chazon Ish.
Wow, very fascinating. You said you may not know too many Bachrim who could do this today. It sounds like you may know a couple, or
no, I don't. I'm
you don't
being
know anybody.
just a figure of speech.
Okay, what's the next sefer you want to discuss?
So the next sefer I would like to discuss is Chibur on the Archas Chaim, which is Miyuchas to the Rosh.
So before we get to this, so this V'yesh Yashev is found. How do you find it today? It's on its own. It's part of the Siach HaSadeh.
It's part of the Siach HaSadeh, but also I think it comes up as V'yesh Yashev on Hebrew books. If you search for Chaim Kanievsky's name on Hebrew books, you'll get many of the Seforim for free. He gave them permission to put up a lot of his Seforim already a while back.
Okay,
and so many more are even on Utah.
Miyuchas Laharash. That rings a bell. Isn't that what many of the yeshivas say during Elul?
Yes, davening? Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this also. Before I get to talking about Rabbi Chaim, I just want to give a little bit what the sefer is, and then I will explain a little bit elaborate what Rabbi Chaim did for this sefer. Okay. So first of all, we have Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky in this again in one of the contrasten that was eventually incorporated into the sefer. He calls it Hashem Archaisav. And he writes that it's the Rosh, and he wrote very bekitzer, but it needs to be. And he says v'heim gufei Torah muvorar begemara u'medrashim, but he didn't bring his makairis, and people don't know where they're from. So he decided to go sit and track down all the makairis, and he brings down the lashonos of Chazal bekitzer. He also it seems he really liked this chibur. He made himself ready at the time. He published it with a mafteach. And over the years, he kept on adding to it. His first ta'ara already, he shtelsu the chidah, that it's the name Archas Chaim is not necessarily the name given to the sefer by the Rosh, but okay. Anyway, now, and he prints the sefer. I'm not sure when it was first printed, but from the end of the sefer, he says, when does he finish it? He finishes it in Yeshiva, Tafshin Yud Aleph in Petach Tikva. So he's pretty young. He's in the low 20s when he puts out this sefer. Now, to give background behind this sefer, okay, so first, like this. You mentioned that you heard and you recall that in El, you used to learn in yeshivas. So it seems the sefer became very accepted as a Musar sefer, but before, how did it become accepted and what's the story behind it? So in the 1620s, there was a plague in Europe, and the Taisis Yantif, after, it seems, when the plague, stopped pretty much, he gave a drasha in his city of Prague, and in the middle of the drasha, he says he wants to make a new takana. And this takana is that to say daily the chibur of Rav Amuvok, the Archas, he calls it the Archas Chaim. It's a Musar sefer. He says it's printed already in some of the Sedurim. He's going to split it into 7 chalakim. So every day to say a few parts of the sefer daily. While when to say it before Baruch She'amar, after everyone's wearing talis and tefillin. Now he realized that not everyone even could understand it, so he translated it into German or Yiddish Deutsch, whatever it's called, so that even the women should be able to understand it. And they could listen, and even children will be able to learn the sefer. And it was printed already then in the 1620s. This sefer with Taisis Yantif. Since then, it was printed numerous times. There's even a skama from the Shagasari at one point where he also says it's known already, and Shagasari is much later than the Taisis Yantif. Akopanim, the sefer becomes very accepted in Klal Yisrael, but no parish was ever really written on this sefer. Which is very interesting, and it's not really. I don't think it's really quoted in Halacha Seforim at all. It seems the Shach. I think there is a Shach that quotes it once or something, but not. You don't see it as a source so much. Now, In the early 1990s, there was a journal called Sfunot, which came out from Bnei Brak, which had a lot of different chashuva people used to send in articles. So one person, a great guy that we lost earlier this year, Reb Shlomo Fisher, wrote in that it might not be miyuchas to the Rush. Okay, and it was a part of an article where he had some other very interesting comments. The next issue, Chashav Yid, who also was recently nifter during Corona, Reb Shmuel Ashkenazi, he wrote in that also talking about it, saying that already early on people were miyachas with the Rush. Okay, but these are all different questions and bibliographical questions about the Chibur. If it is the Rush, it isn't the Rush. Now, a little later, also in the same journal, another issue, someone went ahead and tracked down mamish early manuscripts of it. And the question was, when you learn this chibur, what's pshat in this seder, and what's pshat in it? What was the kavana behind it? Some people said it's a tzava, but there's no indication that it was a tzava of the Rush for his children. Anyway, but whatever it is, even though it was said by a lot of people, but no one sat and learned it. It's a Rishon who wrote it, and to be mimic in what's going on behind the sefer. It seems the Bali Musar took a liking to it. L'mashal in Kelm, they were very into it, and at one point, various gedolim of the Bali Musar were very into it. The Admir Mikelm was very into it, and it seems he spoke about it a lot. Reb Simcha Zisel Mikelm, sorry, Reb Simcha Zisel, by him they used to say Pekfiyas after davening, which is what the Minig Yeshivas is. In El, but it sounds like by them they did it all year round, and others, and became a very known Musar Sefer. Anyway, the Kitzer, a while back in Bnei Brak, they put out an edition of it where they took all the pieces they took all different pieces of Musar, all the great daily Musar where they talk about the Sefer, and they put it in a Sefer. Calling it Archas Chaim Rush. Okay, very nice. Now, they also have the original Yiddish of the Taisus Yantif and stuff like that. And they also have the manuscript that I mentioned earlier that was printed and in a more Musardika, but the Sefer is looked at as a very Musardika Sefer. And it's a very useful, interesting Sefer, easy to learn. And that was what they did. Now, a little earlier than them, there was a great guy in Bnei Brak. His name was Rabbi Yamin Shua Zilber, wrote a lot of Seforim. He decided to put out, this is in the 1950s, I believe it was, to put out a beer on the Sefer. He was very into Rishonim, he did this some other Seforim, and he found it very strange, and no one went to learn the Sefer as a Rishon, the Chedushim in it. And then someone told him, by the way, someone beat you to it. Who beat you to it? Reb Chaim Kanievsky, young Reb Chaim Kanievsky, wrote a sefer on the thing. In the end, he gets permission from him, and it's printed today. This Reb Yamin Zilber edition was printed in many editions, also with the two Perushim, Reb Chaim Kanievsky and Reb Yamin Zilber. Now, Adkan, the what's called the boring bibliographical information about the sefer. Now, let's first focus on Reb Chaim Kanievsky over here. What is Reb Chaim Kanievsky? Here we see Reb Chaim Kanievsky as earlier I was said that he had influence of different people, such as his uncle, which we spoke about, and others. Here we see his tremendous ahava for Rishonim, and anyone who goes through all his farm will see a word of a Rishon is beyond important to him. But not so much that just a word of a Rishon, he went out of his way to track down all different types of Rishonim, even the newest ones printed, and he quotes them all. Here he went, and he took it's the Rush, as he brings, and he says, and he was oimid on to be megala called tag shabatag every makar. Okay, now, what does the word every makar by Reb Chaim Kanievsky mean? So already last time we discussed how he had this chayvus. He's already been doing the chayvus already, it sounds like, for a good few years. I don't know if it had all incorporated everything, but he ends up throwing in kol Torah shebal peh as makairis over here. So it's sort of like a Musar encyclopedia also. So let's say you're looking for you should have Sefer Panim Yafis. So you look up where he talks about Sefer Panim Yafis, and then you'll have 10 Mar Makaimis in Chazal. Now, when this was coming out, this is before computers, before all search engines. Obviously, it's kedai to mention a very cute fact. At the Levaya, they mentioned what the Reb Chaim Kanievsky, his son, mentioned as a hesped. What the Reb Chaim Kanievsky do with his children on these long Friday nights. They were makbid on. They had no chashmal. What did they do? He had a bunch of children. He had to amuse them. So they would test him. There's a sefer put out by Meister of Cook called Mechlalim Amarim Peskamim. All different chazals or things people say from chazal. they would read to him a memra, and they'd say, where is it from? And Chaim Kanievsky would list off what it said there, probably, and then he would list a bunch more. So here he went, this is like an encyclopedia for Musar. If someone needs to get up and give a drasha on Musar, and you want to know Kas. So, okay, today you could type into Google, you get some things, but here, he was doing this way before. He has a bunch of sources. Okay, so that's number one, what he does. Number two is, it's a Rishon, so it's the Rush, right? So he goes and says, what about Rush's other places? Does it work out with other pieces of Rush? So not every piece is a relative, but someone is, and he shows, sometimes it might be a stira. Sometimes he's handling a Gemara, he'll throw in a ha'ara that he saw, a stira somewhere. But it's not just that he's bringing you Bavli, Yerushalmi, Midrashi Halacha, he's bringing Derech Eretz, Tandi Be'elios, all different Midrashim. Last time I spoke about Mechilta de Rajbi, somehow gets in here also. Then he brings even some Musar Svarim. Yisai V'Sharish Avodah many times. He brings in Mesilas Yesharim. He brings in many times the Sefer Chafetz Chaim. Sometimes he even argues. He's throwing at you all different things, different Midrashim from a Sefer Eitzah Midrashim, which Amir Tashem I hope to talk about. And all this is to show, so first of all, he's being mefarish, the Sefer. He's giving the sources from a multiple, sometimes it could be 3 pages of Ha'aris, of Chazals, that talk about this thing. Okay, Bekitzer, you see here this Mordech Chavivas that he had of Farishainim. This is where I'm saying is it could be other Gedalim had it, and people, Mishnah Berurah was also into it, but he, I think, took it to a new level, which I hope to elaborate on more. But that was part of what was his motive in this Sefer Archas Chaim. I just want to show that another thing, one other point that he says, besides for showing with the Rush, so in one of the editions they say, Rabbi Chaskel Sarno was aimed on that there's a lot of similarities between here and Rabbeinu Yainus. Chaim Kanievsky also himself is aimed on this, and he shows sometimes with Rabbeinu Yaina that this could be a makar. Now, I just want to mention just one example for such a thing, which Chaim Kanievsky says in a few short words. He doesn't say all of it, but just to understand why a lot of times when you learn these types of svarim, it's very interesting in a lashon. It's a rishon, and looking at a rishon, how he could word something, a lot of times could be miyashiv something or could help you understand something. So there's a piece of the Archas. So this I just want to give one example. This mamish very bekitzer nimratz. There's a piece where he talks about la'oyev es Hashem b'chol levavcha b'chol nafshcha u'b'chol maidecha. Then he says, "V'tichashev be'amrcha es Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha limsar gufcha u'memayncha al kedushasai." And then he adds the following: "U'bezet tekayim ba'atzmecha divrei hamashayre ki alecha hargeinu kol hayom." What's going on over here? So mamish b'kitzer nimratz. I have Rachmanis over here. Is that there's a famous sefer of the Beis Yosef, which is the Maggid spoke to the Beis Yosef, and a lot to talk about the Sefer. The Kitzer, some people said that it can't be it's the Beis Yosef, because there's a problem with the Sefer. What's the problem with the Sefer? The Beis Yosef says he's going to be Zeicha in the Sefer. The Malach says something to the effect that he's going to be burnt al Kiddush Hashem. And he doesn't die by Kiddush Hashem, or the Beis Yosef doesn't die al Kiddush Hashem with a Sreifa. Okay, whatever. So people use it as a raya. It's a problematic Sefer. What's going on over here? So the Radal, talking about this, in his Sefer Kadmus Hazayr of the Radal, says, B'derech B'kitzer Nimratz, he says, what the kavana over here was, of Rabbi Yosef Kair, wasn't that he's going to be Meiser Nefesh and he's going to die al Kiddush Hashem. You just have to have kavana. You have to have kavana to be Meiser yourself al Kiddush Hashem. Now, the Rabbeinu Yoina says, when does every day one is able to do this? When? During Kriya Shema. That you have to have his lashon, Rabbeinu Yoina's lashon is, v'yigmar b'machshavtoi limsar nafshe al-kedushas Hashem yizbarach l'arg alav, v'tichashev lo l'tzdaka ki'ilu nereg al-kedushas Hashem. If you have these kavanas, it will be ki'ilu you did. Even though you didn't, it's good enough. That's what Rabbeinu Yoina says, and there's other Makairis and different Rishonim for such a thing. That's the kavana over here when the Rush in the Archas Chaim over here also says limsar gufcha. He says when you say es Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha limsar gufcha u'memayncha al kedushasai u'bezet tikayim ba'atzmecha divrei meshayre ki alecha hargeinu kol hayom. Says Reb Chaim Kanievsky over here also. He brings down the piece and then he says he tells to Ayin Rabbeinu Yoina. He brings down the Gemara and Brachas b'chol. He brings down the Gemara and Brachas. He brings down Medrash Hanelam. And then he brings down, this concept is brought down where? in the Yisai V'Sherish Avoida, the Bach and the Mishnah Berurah, they also bring this down, this Yisai. So in a few short words, and this is what the Radal says is really the pshat in the Maggid Beis Yosef, so it's not a raya, there's a problem with the Maggid Beis Yosef. I'll call upon him. This is just one tiny example of the many, it's very small print, so there's a lot of material in here, in this Chibur of Reb Chaim Kanievsky, and we get to see him as a mefarish of a Rishon, using his incredible knowledge at a very young age, that was predating all computers and everything, showing that he was something very, very unique, even at a young age.
Wow. So we have the Yesh Li Yash V'Lo Marsha, which is something unique, may have been done somewhat in the past, but Reb Chaim certainly took it to another level. Then you have Reb Chaim on Orchos Chaim Laharash. Like you said, the sources, the Musar Sefer. Wow, really eye-opening. Okay, so that's number 2. And you still want to talk about a third one?
Yeah, but the third one is not so long. It's like this. I said one of the influences on Reb Chaim Kanievsky is the Vilna Gaon. So again, I hope to elaborate more about this, but in the next small chibur, I want to demonstrate this also. He prints a chibur, which is also in this collection, and he calls it as follows. It's called Tashlum Yefei Einayim, or Kuntris Yefei. Kuntris Tashlum Yefei Einayim, and then afterwards there's another work called Kuntris Mara Makan. These are small contrasim. And what is it? So he says like this. Chaim writes first, Tziyunim umar makaimis b'makam shehuva hamishna b'Yushalmi b'teisefta mechilta teres geihanim sifrei sifrizuta mechilta de Rajbi medrashim kol makaimis asher lo yitzinu b'masaris hashas. Okay. So what's going on over here? So there, again, I will make a very bekitzer. I have to have Rachmanis already on the listeners. It is follows. If you look in Yeshas Vilna, in the back of your Gemara, or today a lot of people use Eis V'Hadar, so you have this, one of the Perushim, in one of the Seforim that was incorporated is Yefei Einayim. What's the Yefei Einayim? So this was a work written by Rabbi Aryeh Yalin. He dies, he's born in the 1820s, he dies in 1886. He learns in Volozhin, a Rav, bunch of Seforim, prominent Litvish Gadol. Okay, fine. What was he unique? One of his uniquenesses was that he wrote this Chibur Yefei Einayim. What's the Chibur Yefei Einayim? So, if you open up the introduction, which is found in the Gemara Brachas, basically, when you learn Gemara, you learn Bavli, Talmud Bavli, a lot of times there could be a piece in Yerushalmi that will be very relevant to you. But it might not be right over there on that Gemara. Maybe you're learning Yevamis, and there's a piece in Yerushalmi in Gittin that could help you understand it. So he makes sure to be mitzayin. But not only that, he does it for a lot of other chiburim, including midrashim, and he writes this, the significance of it. Obviously, when one thinks about this is obviously coming from, he learned in Volozhin, and the Vilna Gaon influence on it is also obvious. So, just to give, and to explain what I'm talking about, I'm just going to use one example from him, and then I'm going to conclude with what Chaim Kanievsky says in his Hagdama about what he was trying to do, and that's it. Basically, there's a chibur about the famous Talmud of the Vilna Gaon, Rav Zalman Mivolozhin, called Toldos Adam. So in there he brings a famous story, a famous thing, very bekitzer. It says in Pasuk, Eikav Hashashama Avram Bekaili, Chazal in the Gemara Yuma Chavches Amabei says, Chaim Avram Avinu Afilu Erev Tafshilin. So the question that everyone asks, what does Erev Tafshilin have to do with this Pasuk? So a Girsa change was suggested that it said Ayin Taf, and the Rosh Tevis is wrong, and it really should be Erev Tchumen, and it will be, and then it will make sense because Erev Tchumen and Ekev there might be some connection. Okay, but and there's endless amount of material about this. So Rabbi Cheskel Feivel brings this down. He says that this mistake to correct it, that the Rosh Tevis was wrong already. He brings the Gra was Aymed on it. Then later on he brings that Rabbi Abela told him that in a Chuvas Rajba he found the Lashon Afilu Erev Tchumen and others. Okay, this is Reb Zalman, and this was a suggestion. It could be Reb Zalman Volozhin also said it, but this is a piece in the Toldos Adam. Now, Yefei Einayim, in that sugya in Yuma, he has a whole piece about it. And basically, what does he do? He brings you down the Gemara. He obviously talks about the Gemara, and then he brings down the Medrash Deveiker Rabbah, a Yerushalmi Kedushin, a Medrash and Bereshis Rabbah, another Medrash, and Medrash Tanchuma, a few places, all where the lashon is Erev Tafshilin. He brings down a Sheikh Toiv, then he brings down Tolas Adam Kilu, and you obviously see that he's holding that he has a lot of gear size that's not like this. And he has a God of Bereshis and other things. Now, so he's bringing down tens of sources, and then he talks about it. So you could see a lot of times it's not just a girsa change. A lot of times it could be a pshat, and he could say it. How does he do this? By his incredible yeda and bekiyas. He was in Torah Shabbal Peh, Bavli, Yerushalmi, etc., etc. Now, so comes along the young. I don't know what age Chaim wrote it, but I'm pretty sure he wrote it when he's relatively young. But I'm not saying it's the same time as that because I forgot the date. It doesn't say a date a lot of times. It says Chaim Kanievsky that it's very important. We know Divrei Torah anim b'makam echad, ashirim b'makam acher. And it's amazing what the Yefei Einayim did. He was Metzayin all the places where Gemara and Midrashim, but he wasn't. There's certain places, especially not in Zram and Tyrus, where it's very, very important because there we don't even have Talmud Bavli. It's very useful and important to do this. So there's also Midrashim that there's Girsais, and he's going to collect them, the ones that he's missing. So he goes and he puts it out. And here you see Chaim Kanievsky, once again, based on his Yeda, incredible Yeda and Torah Shabbal Peh pages of showing you the Midrashim, the Sefri, and other Makairis crowd also and when one uses this, one sees this, so first you're blown away by this type of unbelievable hekif and Yeda. And part of why Chaim Kanievsky was doing it wasn't to show off about his Ma'amar, because he held this is unbelievable, crucial in understanding the sugya. Where is this coming from? This is the Vilna Gaon school. That Kol Torah Shabbal Peh, everything is relative. When you learn a Bavli, you have to know what the Yerushalmi says. You have to know what the Midrashim say. Not only for a girsa, it's a lot of times it could change the pshat. It could be a whole sentence to a story. Okay, and the last thing that he does is the Maramakim is a similar thing. It's Tziyudim from Mekaimis with Rashi and Taisus, he says, that they bring a Medrash, or Yerushalmi, or Tosefta, and it doesn't say where it is. So now, if it's a Medrash on the Pasuk, or says Chaim Kanievsky, I'm not going to bother with it. But a lot of times it isn't. So who's going to know it? Chaim Kanievsky, without batting an eyelash, just goes through, and he lists you all the different places, again, through his crazy knowledge, not only of Bavli Yerushalmi, but of many Midrashim that I mentioned last time, but even some obscure sources. Just to mention one, Sefer Maisis or Rabbeinu Nissim Gaon, which I hope to talk about, where Chaim we have is ha'aris on this whole Sefer from the Gaonim. Anyway, be that as it may, from these three Seforim alone, which are written when he's, two of them for sure he's written when he's young, we're seeing that Chaim Kanievsky did something beyond unique. He took his incredible knowledge of which came through. He wasn't born with it. It was incredible hasmada and chazara, which he was always madgish. His chayvus has now become more and more famous. This book about it, and he took that and he used that information that he learned to be able to be megala and be mefarish areas of Torah on unbelievable levels. I hope to continue with more samples to elaborate, to explain this even more in depth, because this is just the tipa shebayam of the Seforim that he printed.
Thank you so much. What can we do? Learn extra minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes a day. I don't know, for the next month at least. We got to take something from this. Okay, so everybody will take what they could. We're not here to make suggestions, but it's really, really fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing, and we hope to have a few more episodes on this. Thank you.